What's up guys, Pi here, and in this video I'm going over 4 major differences as I see them between hiking high routes and hiking on established trails, and I'll give you a little bit of an insight into our trip this summer through the High Sierra. So on this channel I talk about ultralight backpacking and through hiking, so if you are new here then do consider subscribing. This summer me and 2 friends hiked 400 plus miles through the High Sierra of California. We hiked the Kings Canyon High Basin route, the Southern Sierra High route, the High Sierra Trail and the Sierra High route itself. For reference, I've hiked the Appalachian Trail and the Continental Divide Trail, the Annapurna circuit in Nepal, and a bunch of other smaller trails. The first major difference between hiking on high routes versus hiking on established trails is the amount of off-trail travel and also the navigation that you need to do. On something like the AT and the CDT, the trail is extremely well established. You have a very clear trail to follow. The trail in most places is blazed and marked very well, so it'd be very, very hard to get lost on something like the Appalachian Trail or the PCT. The CDT is not as well established, but there's a much bigger community around the trail. So you have established guidebooks, you have apps that show you exactly where you are on the trail. Whereas all of the high routes that we were doing, for example, the Kings Canyon High Basin route is 2/3 off-trail travel. So you have no trail whatsoever to follow. What that meant was that we had to plot out GPS points on the Cal Topo at home, download those waypoints onto Gaia GPS that we all had on our phones. We did use Andrew Skirker's guidebook. Andrew Skirker came up with the KCHBR, so we did have his guidebook to follow, and we had GPS waypoints to guide us along the way, but we didn't have a definitive trail to follow. So we had a destination in mind. We could possibly see the pass up in the distance, and we could see on the GPS, okay, we're here and we need to get to here, but there's no specific way to get you from point A to B. There may be a recommendation in the guidebook, but it's all up to you. Obviously that's very, very different from hiking on a trail. On a trail, you can more or less switch off a lot of the time. You have the trail to follow. As long as you're paying a little bit of attention and looking at what's around you, you can kind of cruise all day on really well-trodden trail, listen to music and not really have a care in the world. Whereas on high routes, you really need to be paying attention all of the time. The navigation itself is extremely tiring because you're constantly having to check your GPS, check any guidebooks. We did also download some trip reports from people that had done the routes previously, so we had a point of reference to look back on those and sort of say, okay, they went to the right around this valley, let's follow what they did because they said that was pretty good. But oftentimes you just wouldn't have that. You'd say, okay, we're going over this pass over here in the distance, let's just figure out and assess the best way to get from where we're at to where we're going. So the next major difference between hiking on high routes versus hiking on an established trail is that the hiking itself is just harder and you can't move as quickly. When you've got a nice well-trodden trail with switchbacks and a clear path to follow, you can average 2.5 to 3 miles an hour quite easily. But our pace in these high routes was much, much slower because when you're navigating, going hand in hand with the first point, when you are navigating, inherently you're just going to go slower. You're moving over terrain that isn't clearly marked, so you're scrambling over rocks, maybe you're bushwhacking. The hiking itself just tends to be harder because compared to the JMT, the John Muir Trail is still going through the Sierras. It would be considered not a high route, but it is a route through the Sierra Mountains, which are pretty tall. But you can't really compare those two things. Of course, there are long, difficult climbs on the JMT, but the JMT is routed in such a way that it goes through the kind of the easiest passes in the area and also the most beautiful, some of the most beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful trail. But they intentionally route the JMT through areas that are quite accessible. And then if you're going up to a pass, even if it is a difficult climb, you will have those switchbacks and they will take you on a route that's easy to get up to the pass. Whereas on the high routes, quite often someone's looked at a topo map and planned out, okay, I'm going to plan the route to go from here to here to here to here, and linking up various different drainage basins, different valleys. And so you're not necessarily going to have an easy climb because it's like, okay, we need to go from here to here and that's the way to do it. It might be extremely steep on one side, there may be snow. A big, huge part of this, the harder hiking, is the talus that we faced in the High Sierra. You are hiking over some talus, of course, on the John Muir Trail, but compared to what we did on, for example, the Kings Canyon High Basin route, the Southern Sierra High Route and the Sierra High Route itself, some of the talus fields we had to deal with were huge. We could be hiking on talus for 2 hours, some of it really unstable. And talus, anything from huge boulders to small loose pebbles that would like skirt out as you were hiking over them. That kind of hiking is just much harsher. Even if you're hiking through talus on the JMT, you know that, okay, this is the way to go. The path itself is well trodden. It may be unstable, but not as unstable as talus that may have never been stepped on by another human, at least not for many years. We also had to do some snow traversing in the high routes, thankfully not an awful lot. Obviously moving over snow does slow you down a bit. We carried ice axes, we carried micro spikes, but fortunately because we decided to do the routes later in the year, we didn't face a lot of snow, which was great, so we didn't really need that ice equipment too much. Another big difference between high routes and routes that involve off-trail hiking versus on-trail hiking is water crossings. If you're crossing water on an established trail, whether that be the PCT or the JMT, if there is a designated water crossing, there might be a bridge. If there's not, then someone has obviously routed the water crossing in a safe, in theoretically safe point to cross the water, and you know that other people have gone over that several times. Whereas on the high routes, it's like, okay, we need to be on the other side of the water, we need to scout around and find the safest place possible to cross. And you can do as much scouting as you like, but in certain situations you just have to get across that water. We definitely had some crossings in the Sierra that were pretty sketchy, and if we'd have fallen in, it could have been really bad. That's another thing that's just going to slow you down. Of course, hiking in the mountains, such as the Sierras, is going to be more difficult hiking anyway, but on something like the PCT, of course you do pass through the mountainous areas, but you might be in those areas for 3 to 4 days and then you pass into easier rolling terrain. Whereas on the trip that we did, which was 5 weeks, 400 plus miles, we were consistently high up in the Sierra. So there's no relief. You're constantly going up mountain passes, down the other side, through the valley, and then up and over the next one, as opposed to on a normal through hike where you pass through different environments and different terrains, and that enables you to kind of move faster, and there's inevitably areas of much easier hiking. That kind of hiking where you are going up a steep pass and down the other side, through a valley and then up and over the next one, especially over talus, of course is just very physically demanding. You're using a lot of muscle and a lot of wind and cardio kind of going up, and then coming down it's really hard on the joints, especially knees and ankles, and you need to take your time and pay a lot of attention going down because that talus is often very unstable and very dangerous. Cheesebeard, one of the hiking partners I was on the trip with, he had a boulder roll onto his foot. His foot was trapped for a while. Fortunately, he managed to pull his foot out of the shoe and then go down and dig his shoe from out underneath the boulder. But when he basically screamed out to me, I thought that he'd crushed his foot under a boulder. And this really leads into my next point, is that hiking on high routes inherently has more risk than hiking, generally speaking, on established trails. Because on established trails, people have intentionally routed the trail in a certain spot to avoid as much risk as possible, whether that be the pass itself. If the pass itself is risky, then they will obviously move the trail to a different area, but if you have to go up and over a certain pass, someone's taken the time to assess the area and say, okay, this is the best spot to go over the pass, this is the best approach. You don't have that benefit on a high route. Of course, someone in theory has scouted out the pass itself to try and mitigate that as much as possible, but you don't don't have the benefit of knowing, okay, this is exactly where we need to go up, this is exactly where we need to come down. You might have information available to you, okay, stay left because the talus on the right hand side is very loose and unstable, but there's inevitably situations where you need to make those decisions for yourself. You need to look at the situation, look at maybe a guidebook you're following or trip reports that you've read and say, okay, this is the information I've got, this is where I need to go, and I need to figure out the best way to get there. Obviously that presents more risk. And obviously the high routes tend to go through areas that involve a lot more technical terrain, whereas established trails go through areas that are a little bit easier to hike, because you don't want to drop the average maybe beginner backpacker into very technical terrain away from crowds of people where they might hurt themselves. Whereas that really is the definition of high routes. They are more technical, there are less people. And so the established trails are putting areas to make it accessible to people and give them a great wilderness experience without adding too much risk in. And then that leads into my fourth and final point for this video, is that you're just not going to see the same amount of people on the high routes and off-trail hiking than you would have on an established trail. We hiked the High Sierra Trail, which is a trail in itself. Aside from that, and where the routes that we hiked hit the JMT, which they did at several points, we probably saw less than 20 people on the high routes themselves. Whereas when we were down on the JMT for a few miles, say an hour of hiking, it wouldn't be surprising to see 20 people in that 1 hour. So there's just not that many people out on these high routes. I think the Kings Canyon High Basin route is 2/3 off trail, and so you just don't get a lot of people out there. The Sierra High Route, probably the most famous of the high routes through the Sierra that's been around for a long, long time, we still maybe only saw 3 or 4 people actually hiking those routes. Whereas the JMT, it was like a corridor of people coming through. Obviously, most people are going to want to tackle high routes like this because there are less people. If you want a really, truly wild experience out in the mountains, then I highly recommend these high routes. But if you're looking for a very sociable hike where you meet lots of people, then the high routes really aren't for you. I personally have grown to love this kind of trip a lot more. When I first hiked the Appalachian Trail back in 2015, I was out there for a social experience. Of course, I wanted to, you know, have fun and go on this epic adventure, but I wanted a social experience. Whereas now, big crowds of people not behaving as well as they probably should be kind of turns me off a little bit. So something like this Sierra High Route and the routes through the Sierras that we just did was an amazing wilderness experience, and I'll continue to seek those out going forward in the future. So those are the 4 big differences as I see them between hiking high routes and hiking established trails. Of course there are more. If you've got any questions for me about the high routes that we tackled, then drop them in the comments below. If you haven't already, then please do subscribe to this channel, and it really helps me if you like this video. Thanks for watching. I will catch you in the next one.